If you have been on any sort of emotional wellness journey, or certainly any sort of trauma healing journey, you have undoubtedly heard inner child many times. You may have done a lot of inner child work. But when it comes to healing from childhood trauma, inner child work can mean some different things, and it can be incredibly challenging, beneficial, but certainly challenging. So let's talk about it. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. The idea of inner child has been around for a very long time before I probably was even doing this work. But one of the things that often happens is that people often don't really understand exactly what that means. And I'm certainly talking about just the regular population, but also it can mean different things to different therapists. And part of that might be based on training or just ideas in general. But when we as an individual, just a regular old person, is working on healing or thinking about healing, and we see this idea of inner child all over the place and in a lot of different types of contexts, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel confusing. And if you are somebody that has carried a deep wound that you might have some difficulty being able to fully acknowledge how deep that wound is, if you're somebody that carries a lot of shame, and I've not known anybody who's experienced childhood sexual trauma who doesn't carry a lot of shame, then the idea of the inner child can create some difficulty. It can create some challenges along this journey. So as I talk about this today, obviously this is my opinion and my perspective. And you might hear something different from somebody else, and it doesn't make one person wrong or right. It's just kind of a different viewpoint. And I want to share this viewpoint with you because if you're watching this, there's a good chance that you've watched a lot of my other videos. And I think so there's something that resonates with you around how I talk about this. So because this is such an important issue for people, and not just being able to understand it, but being able to work with it, I think is important. So first, the idea of kind of healing the inner child or understanding or witnessing the inner child, I am in agreement with all of that. And I will say too, with internal family systems or parts work, there's different ways that people refer to it. They may have heard about it. Not necessarily specifically inner child is what you will hear, but there are different parts of yourself. And I believe almost always, if not always, some of those parts are going to be a child part. And that makes all of this makes complete sense, right? Because the wound, if you're a survivor of childhood trauma, the predominant wounding happened as a child. And this is something I have conversations with quite often with my clients, because recognizing that the wound happened to a child is really important to be able to conceptualize it in that way, because as people who have experienced childhood trauma, we first of all have difficulty ever in our adult lives, and even sometimes in our teenage lives, and even actually our younger lives, we have a lot of difficulty really being able to see ourselves as children. Even as adults, when we think about our childhood trauma, we view it through a lens of who you are now. And we often have judgment about thinking, I should have known better, or I should have thought this, or I should have told somebody, or whatever it is you're saying to yourself. But you're saying that from the person that you are now, the adult, most significantly just the adult that you are now that has much more autonomy over your life generally, and certainly your choices. So recognizing that the wounding happens as a child, and any subsequent wounding that we experience that has any familiarity whatsoever, that child is experiencing that wound, the new wound, the hurt that you feel, the fear that you feel, the anger that you feel, whatever it is that you're feeling, or even the numbness that you're feeling. The part of you that experienced those original wounds, that part is feeling this new wound as well. Because it's a familiar feeling to that child. And so in my work, I don't necessarily refer to it as inner child healing or inner anything like that. Not that there's something wrong with that, but I just don't use those words necessarily, generally speaking. But being able to recognize the reality of that and what that actually means is, I believe, kind of critically important, not only to your healing overall, but part of the reason that it's critically important to your overall healing is because when we can connect, recognize, acknowledge, honor, validate the reality of what that means for the child who experienced that, we work toward, it's not immediate, generally speaking, but we work toward compassion. We work toward understanding. We work toward kindness and love toward that child. We certainly work on reducing judgment and shame that we have carried because there's this part of ourselves, this older part of ourselves, even if it's a year older than what you were when a specific thing happened, that believes that that child, whether it was 3 years old or 5 years old or 10 years old, whatever age, even if we're 12 at the time, we're thinking that that 3-year-old, that 5-year-old, that 7-year-old should have done something different. And that really is where so much judgment and shame comes from. Not solely where it comes from, but it's a huge part of it. And like most everything, we don't necessarily have to have conscious thoughts of those types of things specifically. We may not have an awareness that we are having really specific thoughts in that way, but the impact, because it's there, the impact is what we tend to recognize. And we tend to experience it as evidence or proof of how we are judging that child. And now I gave some different ages, right? But that is true whether you're a teenager, an early teen, or a later teen. We're still experiencing the same types of things. Obviously, developmentally, we're in a different place. But when you are being abused as a child, particularly by somebody that you know and trust, and potentially love, potentially have to depend on, where your food, your shelter, your sense of safety, whatever that might be, if the person that you rely on for those things is the person who is hurting you or not doing anything to stop it, whether they know or don't know, that is incredibly impactful. So no matter what age, but I know for many people that experience childhood trauma, for the majority of people, it doesn't start at 15 or 16 years old. It may, and that doesn't diminish their experience. I'm just wanting to point out for anybody watching this that when you experience it at a younger age, developmentally, your capacity to process isn't there. in the same way that it would be for somebody who is older. And even if you are abused as an older person, like a teenager, and certainly even an adult, but I'm talking about childhood right now, if you had any abuse experiences before, just like what I said a little while ago, if at 15 something happens and something happened when you were like 5 and 6 years old and nothing happened in between, at 15, 16 years old, even if it's a different person, this 5 or 6 year old is going to feel that. It's going to, that 5 or 6 year old in a sense is re-experiencing something that they've already experienced. So at 15 or 16 years old, you may have a different kind of way of looking at it or thinking about it, however that might be. But there's a part of you that is experiencing it again as a 5 or 6 year old. And I'm talking about on an emotional level. And so that might be important to clarify. So I'm not talking about regressing. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about on an emotional level, that is what is happening. And that's part of the reason why when people have abuse throughout their childhood, or maybe have different abusers at different points in their life, how sometimes it can seem like something later by somebody that you didn't necessarily love and trust abuses you, why that sometimes can seem more difficult than the thing that happened by somebody that you loved and trusted when you were much younger for a longer period of time, potentially. Not that it on a really deep level technically does have more impact, but it can feel like it does because you're in a different place experiencing it, and the wounding from that younger part of yourself is kind of coming back up to the surface. So one of the challenges that people often have, and I definitely struggled with this as well, is that because we tend to not be able to see ourselves as innocent children, because children are innocent, they have no part, they are not at fault ever under any circumstance. But we can't see that because we do blame ourselves. So being able, so there's a disconnect, right? So we can maybe even look at a picture of ourselves at, say, 5 years old, and we can say, yeah, that's me, but there's no emotional connection. There may not even be kind of an ability to remember what it felt like to be that age. That's not at all uncommon. And part of that is just the older that we get, the harder that is, just kind of generally across the board. But for a lot of people, it's happening because even somebody at like 15 can have a lot of difficulty, maybe feeling impossible to be able to have any sense of what it felt like to be 5. But that happens because we are so disconnected. Sometimes we blame that younger part of ourselves. Sometimes, oftentimes, we judge and we shame that part of ourselves. We might even like look at a picture of ourselves at that age or think of ourselves at that age and kind of judge in a way that's like, well, that kid was bad, that kid was dirty, that kid was selfish, that kid was a bad kid, whatever it is. And we do that because we want to separate. We want to believe that we can do something differently now to separate ourselves from that. And if we're still a young person or still in a vulnerable position, we believe that maybe we can do something now to protect ourselves. So sometimes the work that I do with my clients is about being able to see that child, whatever age, to see that child as a child, as a real living child, whether it was at 1 year old, or again, any age, even at 16, 17 years old. And not that magically at 18, it has a different impact on you, because it doesn't. Again, especially, I mean, there's differences, but it's still going to have a significant impact, especially when it's somebody that you have known, loved, and trusted. And there are too many people to count who experience childhood trauma and continue to experience trauma into their adult lives by the same person, and also certainly by other people down the road. That's incredibly common, unfortunately. So being able to see that child as a child, to be able to recognize that that child could not have done anything to cause somebody to do what they did. That's a challenge on this journey. It's always been. I've not had anybody that I have ever worked with, I'm almost 100% positive, in which that was an easy thing to be able to do. And even sometimes when they've done a lot of healing, it's not an easy thing to do. Even for myself at this stage, and part of that might just be because I'm older, but I can look at a picture of myself. Sometimes it's harder than others as a child, and feel like I don't even know who that kid is. And it doesn't bring up anything bad for me anymore. There was a time that it did. But I really feel so disconnected from the reality of who that child was. And I was somebody that, like, I never felt like a kid. I was what is called a parentified child. But being able to accept the reality, which can be painful much of the time, because that reality is where so much of the pain and hurt and betrayal lives. But being able to do that is what allows us to honor, to validate, to see the courage and the strength and the resilience. And that is so much, when it comes to healing from childhood trauma, that is so much what healing is about. Because in doing that, it helps you shift. It helps you begin to dismantle, or continue to dismantle, the beliefs that were created around that. It allows you to be able to see, as I just mentioned, the courage, the strength, the resilience, all of that, the innocence. One of the things that has always broken my heart, every time I hear it, is somebody who will talk about being abused as a child. And again, it could be pretty much any age. And they will say, my innocence was stolen. Or I was no longer innocent. And that just, it really does break my heart, because of what they believe that means about them. And for some people, it can be a very shaming thing that they believe. And for other people, it's more a sense of the freedom that children should be able to have. And in that sense, I would agree with it. And I do think that, I don't think you're innocent, because I believe that children are still innocent. But that freedom to just live, to love, to feel safe, that is definitely not there any longer. But in being able to connect with the reality of that part of ourselves, however you want to refer to it, I will often, with clients, talk about the 4-year-old part of yourself, or the 10-year-old part of yourself, or even the 15-year-old part of yourself. That's where a lot of my shame lived, from like 13 to 15 years old. And I didn't realize that until I had done a lot of healing, but so much of the shame that I felt was that like 12 to 15-year-old part of myself. But that is ultimately how we change the beliefs, how we create space to accept the reality of who we are. It is where we begin to shed that shame that was never ours to carry. So there are a lot of different things that you can do to get to a place where you can honor and validate the child parts of yourself. It's generally not going to be anything easy. It's generally not going to be something that can happen quickly. But there are ways that you can work toward that. And I will say that if you're on this journey and you don't have professional support, just try to be really, really mindful of the impact that any work that you're doing, anything that you're watching or listening to, try to be really mindful of the impact that it's having on you. And again, you may not have an immediate response. It may be something that pops up over the next couple of days or potentially even a couple of weeks. And this is again where journaling can be helpful to recognize. So I want to be mindful of what I'm suggesting, because I know some of you are not working with somebody. In fact, probably most of you are not working with somebody. And so if you're working on your own, be kind of gentle about how you're leaning into it. So what I mean by that is, don't like go out and get a book on inner healing and read the whole thing in one sitting and do all the things that they tell you to do. Please do not do that. Even if you're working with somebody, please don't do that. I'm not suggesting that you don't get a book or something, but what tends to happen for a lot of trauma survivors is they dive all in. Like there's no dipping the toe in, it's all in. And that is generally not a great idea across the board. So whatever you're doing, even if you're just reflecting on your own, or certainly if you're doing anything externally to help, be gentle with it, meaning do it a little bit at a time. Try to be really mindful and pay attention to what's happening internally as you're doing whatever it is. Make sure you're staying connected. Be very intentional about healthy distraction so that you can, in a sense, kind of compartmentalize, especially if you're doing it on your own, because having the ability to like put it in a little box and put it away and then distract yourself in a healthy way to really move your mind and your energy away from that can be really, really important. And this is true, again, if you are working with somebody. And if you are working with somebody and, maybe you're talking about, maybe you're doing some internal family systems work, maybe you're talking about the inner child, or maybe you're not, but if you're working with somebody, sharing the difficulty that you have with acknowledging or connecting with, or certainly validating that part of yourself, that is an important part of your healing. Being able to recognize, how do you hold that child responsible? What words do you use to describe that child part of yourself? How do you feel when you look at a picture of yourself at a younger age? Do you have nice thoughts, or are they not so nice? And maybe it has nothing to do with trauma or abuse, but noticing what the thoughts are, because many of those automatic sorts of thoughts and reactions we have, even if we're not thinking about trauma, are a result of the beliefs that were formed from the trauma. So, regardless of whether you're working with somebody or not, be mindful about not jumping in all at once, and learning to connect with that child part of ourselves is part of the healing. Even if you received therapy as a child, as you continue to develop emotionally, psychologically, there's going to be things that shift, and doing it again periodically can be really helpful. One of the really healing things that I experienced, and it wasn't like a deep, and it certainly wasn't like a really emotional sort of thing, but I was able to connect to that 13-year-old that I saw as so bad, so bad for so many reasons. So many reasons. When I was 13, before certainly and after certainly, but 13-ish is when it really became significant. So many things kind of came together, and there were so many ways that I viewed myself that were so horrible. Like I was just a horrible person. So much later in my life, long after I had done a lot of healing, I was able to connect with from my adult self, from the part that is more compassionate and understanding and more connected to that kind of matriarchal energy. I was able to have a healing experience. Not something that I intended, kind of set out to try to create or anything, but because I was in such a different place and I became aware of something, I was able to do that. And it really does help. That idea that I talk about of returning to wholeness, right? That we're already whole, but all the stuff makes us forget that, right? And so healing in large part is about returning to that sense, that felt experience of being whole, that sense of freedom that children feel to laugh and to play and to try and to love and all of that. Healing is about bringing all the parts of ourselves together. It's about a remembering of who we have always been. Always, no matter what beliefs or fears or views get in the way. So it's not easy. And however you tend to think about it, whatever modality you might be experiencing on this healing journey, being able to heal from childhood trauma does require us to be able to see that child as real, as a part of us. All the parts of that child, the dreams, the fears, the pain, the moments of lightness, or maybe even laughter and joy. That part of us is still here. And our healing isn't just for the person that exists in this moment. It's for all the parts of us that existed to this moment, and for the parts of us that will continue to exist and that deserve to feel that sense of freedom long into the future. I'd love to hear from you. What did you notice coming up? Share in the comments. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.